Pseudo classes in CSS and pseudo elements in CSS. What's the difference between these selectors in CSS? Well, for one, pseudo classes has one colon and pseudo element has two colons. But aside this very subtle difference, how do you know what selector is a pseudo class and what selector is a pseudo element? I'll be explaining that in this video, so let's jump straight to it. Pseudo classes in CSS allows you to style an element in a specific state. These classes are applied to elements when a situation occurs or when a state occurs. And there are different states that can apply to elements. Here is a H1 element that I have here. This is the HTML part of it, H1 element with the pseudo text. This H1 element can be in different states at different points in time. For example, when I click on the element, it has an active state. Also, when the mouse is currently on the element as it is now that you can see, the element is in the hover state. And of course, there are so many other states that can be applied to different elements in HTML. I'm going to show you three examples here. So let's start from the first one, which is hover. When the mouse is currently on this element, the hover state is triggered. And when that state is triggered, we can use the hover pseudo class to apply some styles to it. And I'll show you how. So here is the CSS part of it here. I'm going to use H1 and then I have the one colon and then I have hover, and here I can say color yellow, background color brown. When I go back here and I refresh, you can see that when I hover, the H1 element is now in the hover state and the styles I applied to it now show. When I stop hovering, you can see the styles are no longer applied. Another pseudo class that I want to show you is the placeholder-shown, which is used on input. So let me add my input here first. Here I'm going to add a placeholder and it's going to say enter input. And this is the result here. These inputs can have different states. You can see that here the placeholder is currently shown, it says enter input, but when I type something here, the enter input no longer shows. Well, there is a pseudo class for the placeholder states. So when the placeholder is currently shown, it has the pseudo class of placeholder-shown, and we can use that pseudo class to apply some styles to the input. So here I can say input placeholder-shown, and then I can say border 5 pixels solid purple, and then I can have the input to by default have a border of 1 pixel solid yellow. When I come back here and refresh, you can see that because the input is currently in the state of the placeholder showing, the 5 pixels border of purple is shown. But when I type something and the input disappears, you can see now it has a yellow border. One more pseudo class I want to show you is the disabled pseudo class, which can be applied on input and a couple of elements, but I'm going to use a button element for this example. It says click me. This is the click me button. When I make this button disabled, you can see the button is currently disabled. I cannot click it. Well, there is a pseudo class for that also. So in the CSS here, I can say button, and then using the disabled class, I can say the border should be 1 pixel solid purple because I like purple. I can also say the color should be red. I can also apply a cursor type of not allowed. Now when I refresh, you can see that the color of the text is red, the border is purple, and you can see the cursor is saying not allowed. But when I go back to this button and I remove the disabled state, you can see that the button now returns to normal. So you can see that the pseudo classes are applied to when situations. When an element is in a particular state, then you can use the pseudo class for that state to apply some styles to it. How about pseudo elements? Well, pseudo elements on the other hand allows you to style a part of an element or to add an extra element to an existing one. So I'll go to this H1 here and just remove this hover so I can show you what I mean. So you have this H1 element and this element has different parts. Using different pseudo elements, you can style different parts of this H1 element. I'll be showing you 3 examples here also. The first example is the selection pseudo element, which allows you to style the highlighted part of an element, which is usually a text element. Here, when I highlight this S, E, and U, you can see that the default background color is a light blue and the color of the text is black. Well, I can apply some styles to this highlighted part, and I do that using the selection pseudo element. So I can say H1 and then double colons, then I have the selection, and here I can say the color should be blue and the background color should be yellow. When I go back to this element and I refresh, you can see that by highlighting P and S, you can see the blue and the yellow. If I highlight O and U, you can see the blue and the yellow. So using the selection pseudo element, I'm able to style a specific part of this element, which is the highlighted part. Another pseudo element I want to show you is the placeholder. You can see this input here. The whole of this input has different parts, and one of of the parts that it has is the placeholder. Well, I can style the placeholder differently from the normal text in the input. I'm going to show you that here. So here in the input, I'm going to say input, and then I use the placeholder pseudo element. And for this placeholder, I can apply a color of red, I can apply a font style of italics, and I can apply a font size of 50 pixels. So when I come here and refresh, you can see we don't even see it. So let me reduce it to 20 pixels so that it's visible. So you can see the enter input. We are styling the placeholder differently from the normal input text. For the input text, I'm going to give it a color of purple again, and then I'm going to give it a font size of 14 pixels. So when I come back, you can see that the placeholder has the enter input, which is italics and also in color red. But when I search something else, you can see that the text is different. The text is in color purple and it's also in 14 pixels. So using the placeholder pseudo element, we're able to style the placeholder part of an input. Another pseudo element I want to show you is the after pseudo element. The after pseudo element allows you to add an extra element, which is called the pseudo element, after the target element. So I'm going to apply that to the H1 again. There is also the before, but I'm just going to use after. So for this after, you specify a content property, and I'm just going to add this as the content. Then I'm going to give this a font size of 50 pixels and a color of purple again. When I come back here and I refresh, you can now see that the after pseudo element has added extra element after the H1 element. So the pseudo element allows you to style a specific part of an element, while the pseudo classes allows you to style an element when it is in a specific state. Another thing to note is that some pseudo element allows you to use one colon, like after. If I come here and I refresh, you can see it's like this again. The reason for this is that the double colon distinction for pseudo elements was not introduced in early versions of browsers. So some pseudo elements like before, after, and a few others, they still work with one colon in some browsers. So I hope with this video you get to understand the difference between pseudo classes and pseudo elements, and hopefully now you get a better understanding of CSS selectors. If you enjoyed this video, you can give it a like and also subscribe for more simplified content.